wearying business, being plague-stricken, but it's still more wearying to refuse to be. That's why everyone in the world today looks so tired. Everyone is tired of the plague. But that is also why some of us, those who want to get rid of the plague, feel such a desperate weariness, a weariness from which nothing remains to set us free except death. I know I have no place in the world of today. Once I'd refused to kill, I doomed myself to exile that can never end. I leave it to others to make history. I also know I'm not qualified to pass judgment on those others. There's something lacking in my mind, and its lack prevents me from being a rational murderer. So it's a deficiency, not a superiority. I'm willing to be as I am. I've learned modesty. All I maintain is that on this earth, there are pestilences and there are victims, and it's up to us, as far as possible, not to join forces with pestilence. This may sound very simple to the point of childishness, and I can't judge that, but I feel that it's true. I've heard so many arguments which turned heads enough to make them approve of murder, and I've come to realize that all our troubles spring from our failure to use plain and clean language. So I've tried always to speak and act very clearly, as this is the only way of setting myself on the right track. So I say there are pestilences and victims and nothing more. If by making that statement I become a carrier of the plague, at least I don't do it on purpose. I am trying to be an innocent murderer. I have no great ambition. Maybe there's a third category. Healers? But it's a fact you don't come across many of them. I've only met a few. And it must be a very hard job. So I've decided to take, in every predicament, the victim's side, so as to reduce the damage I do. Among victims, I can at least try to discover how one attains to the third category, in other words, to peace. My God. Tarrou was swinging his blade, tapping the terrace lightly with his heel. After a silence, the doctor raised himself a little in his chair and asked if Tarrou had an idea of the path to follow for attaining peace. Why, yes, he replied. Empathy and sympathy. 2 ambulances were clanging in the distance. The dispersed shouts they had been hearing off and on drew together on the outskirts of the town near the hill, and suddenly there was a sound like gunshots. And then silence fell again. Ryu counted 2 flashes of the revolving light. The breeze freshened, and a gust coming from the sea filled the air for a moment with the smell of brine. And at the same time they heard the low sound of waves lapping the foot of the cliffs. It comes to this, Tarrou said casually. What interests me is learning how to become a saint. But you don't believe in God, said the doctor. Well, exactly, he said. Can you be a saint without God? That's the problem, the math problem, the only thing I'm ever up against. A sudden blaze sprung up above the place the shouts had come from, and a rumor of many voices came to their ears. The blaze died down almost at once, leaving behind a dull red glow, and in the break of the wind they heard strident yells and the discharge of guns, followed by the roar of an angry crowd. Tarrou stood up and tried to listen, but nothing more could be heard. It's a skirmish at the gates. Oh, it's over now, Dr. Ryu said. Tarrou replied, It's never over. There will always be more victims. Maybe, the doctor answered, but I feel more fellowship with the defeated than with saints. Heroism and sanctity don't appeal to me at all. What interests me is just being alive, being human. We're both after the same thing, but I'm even less ambitious than you. There was another gust of wind, and Ryu felt it warm on his skin. Tarrou shook himself. Do you know, he said, what we should do now? For friendship's sake. Whatever you like, Tarrou. Let's go for a swim. It's a harmless pleasure that even a saint can indulge in. With our passes, we can get out on the pier. It's so silly living only in and for the plague. Of course, a man should fight for the victims, but if you stop caring about anything outside of that, what's the use of fighting? Okay, Dr. Ryu said. Let's go. Some minutes later, the car drew up at the harbor gates. The moon had risen, and dappled with shadows, the town lay around them. Behind them, tier on tier, from the town, came warm, fetid breaths of air that urged them towards the sea. They showed their passes to the guard, and then crossed open ground littered with casks and headed toward the pier. The air here reeked of stale wine and fish. They cleanly heard the sound of waves breaking on the big stone blocks. Slowly the waters rose and sank. With their tranquil breathing, sudden oily glints formed and flickered over the surface in a haze of broken lights. Before them the darkness stretched out to infinity. Ryu could feel under his hand the gnarled, weather-worn visage of the rock, and a strange happiness possessed him. Turning to Teru, he caught a glimpse on his friend's face of the same happiness, but a happiness that was not forgetful, that forgot nothing, not even murder. They dived in, and after the first shock of cold had passed, the water seemed tepid. When Dr. Ryu had taken a few strokes, he found the sea was warm that night, with the warmth of autumn that borrows from the shore the accumulated heat of the long day of summer. His feet left a foaming wake as he swam ahead, and the water slipped along his arms to close in on his legs. He lay on his back and stayed motionless, gazing up at the dome of sky lit by the stars and moon, and drew a deep breath. Teru had caught up with him, and he could now hear him breathing. They swam together, timing their strokes. Teru was a stronger swimmer, and Dr. Ryu had to put on speed to keep up with him. For a bit they swam side by side, in the same rhythm, isolated from the world. Dr. Ryu was the first to stop, and then they swam back slowly, except for at one point when they found themselves caught briefly in an ice-cold current. Their energy was whipped up by this trap the sea had sprung on them, and they both swam more vigorously. They started back. Neither one had said a word, but they were conscious of being good friends, and the memory of this night was cherished by them both. When they caught sight of the plague watchman, Dr. Ryu guessed that Teru, like himself, was thinking that the disease had given them a break, and this was good. But now they must set their shoulders to the wheel again. I'm going to read through to part 5. I don't think I can read all of it tonight. The plague gave short shrift indeed, and they must set their shoulders to the wheel again. Through December, it smoldered in the chest of the townsfolk, fed the fires in the crematorium, and peopled the camps with human jetsam. In short, it never stopped progressing with its jerky but unfaltering stride. The authorities had reckoned on the coming of winter to halt its progress, but it lasted through the first cold spells without the least remission. So the only thing for us to do was to go on waiting, isolating, and since after too long waiting one gives up waiting, the whole town lived as if it had no future. As for Dr. Ryu, the brief hour of peace and friendship which had been granted him was not and could not be repeated. Another hospital had been opened, and his only converse now was that with his patients. But he noticed a change in the epidemic. Now that the plague was assuming almost always the pneumonic form, the patients, after their fashion, seemed to be seconding the doctor. Instead of giving way to prostration or frenzies of the early period, they had a clear idea of where their interests lay, and on their own initiative asked for what might be most beneficial. And so they were always asking for something to drink and being kept warm. And though the demands on him were as exhausting as before, he no longer had the impression that he was fighting with his patients. The patients were not only cooperating, but asking for his help again. Toward the end of December, he received a letter from Auton, who was still in quarantine. The magistrate stated that his quarantine period was over, but the date of his admission to camp was mislaid by the secretary, and if he was still detained, it was due to a mistake. His wife, released from quarantine, had gone to the prefect's office to protest and had been treated rudely. They told her that the office never made mistakes. Ryu asked Rambert to look into the matter, and a few days later Auton came to see him. There had in fact been a mistake, and Dr. Ryu showed some indignation. But Auton, who had become thinner, raised a deprecating hand, weighed his words, and said that everyone can make mistakes. And the doctor thought to himself that decidedly something had changed. "What will you do now, Auton?" Ryu asked. "I suppose you have a pile of work awaiting you." "Well, as a matter of fact," he said, "I'm putting in for leave." "Oh, I quite understand. You need rest." "It's not that," he said. "I want to go back to camp." Ryu couldn't believe his ears. "But you've only just come out of quarantine." "I'm afraid I didn't make myself clear. I'm told there are voluntary workers from government offices in that camp." He turned his head a little and tried to smooth down his hair. "It would keep me busy, you see. And I know it might sound absurd, but I would feel less separated from my little boy if I was helping others who were ill. Dr. Ryu stared at him. There was gentleness suddenly in those hard, expressive eyes. "Of course," Dr. Ryu said. "I'll fix it up for you." And he kept his word, and the life of the plague-ridden town resumed its course until Christmas. Theroux continued to bring his quiet efficiency to bear on every problem. Rambert confided in the doctor that, with the connivance of the two young guards, he was sending letters to his wife, and now and then getting an answer. He suggested to Ryu that he should avail himself of this clandestine channel, and finally Dr. Ryu agreed to. In the first time in many months, he sat down to write a letter. He found it very difficult, as if he were manipulating a language he had forgotten. The letter was sent, and the reply was slow in coming. As for Cottard, he was prospering, making money hand over fist in small, shady transactions. Grand, however, was otherwise. The Christmas season did not seem to agree with the little bureaucrat. Indeed, Christmas that year had none of its old-time associations. It felt more like hell than heaven. Empty shops, dumb chocolates or empty boxes in the windows, streetcars laden with tired, dispirited passengers, as unlike any previous Christmas as could be. In the past, all the townspeople, rich and poor, indulged in some sort of festivity, but now only a very privileged few, with money to burn, could do so, and they caroused in shamefast solitude in dingy back rooms or privacy. In the churches there were more supplicants than carols. There were a few children, too young to realize what threatened them, playing in the cheerless streets, but no one dared to bid them welcome in. The Santa of former days, bringer of gifts, old as human sorrow, new as the hopes of youth. There was no room in hearts but for a very old gray hope, the hope that keeps men from letting themselves drift to death, the hope that is nothing but a dogged will to live. Grand did not show up as usual, and feeling somewhat anxious, Dr. Ryu called at his place early in the morning, but Grand was not home. His friends were asked to watch out for him. At about 11, Rambert came to the hospital with the news that he had seen Grand wandering aimlessly, looking very strange. Unfortunately, he had lost sight of him. Theroux and the doctor set out in their car to hunt for Grand. At noon, Dr. Ryu stepped out of his car into the frozen air, as he had just caught sight of Grand a distance away, his face at a shop window full of crudely carved wooden toys. Tears were flowing down the old man's cheeks, and this wrung the doctor's heart, because he could understand. A picture rose up before him of a scene of long ago, a youngster standing in front of another shop window, like this one, dressed for Christmas, with his darling Jean turning toward him, and saying how happy she was. He could guess that through the mists of the past years, from the depths of fond despair, Jean's voice was rising and echoing in Grand's ears. And he knew also what the old man was thinking as his tears flow, that a loveless world is a dead world, and always there's an hour when one is weary of prisons and work and duty, and all one craves for is a loved face, the warmth and wonder of a loving heart. Grand saw the doctor's reflection in the window. Still weeping, he turned. "Oh, doctor," he said. Dr. Ryu couldn't speak. He made a vague, understanding gesture. He felt a passionate indignation we feel when confronted by the anguish that all people share. "Doctor, if only I had time to write to her, to let her know." Almost roughly, Dr. Ryu took Grand's arm and drew him forward. Grand did not resist. "Too long, it's lasted too long. All the time one's wanting to let oneself go, and then one day one has to. I know I look quiet like anybody else, but it's always been a terrible effort only to be normal. And now it's too much for me." He stopped. He was trembling violently, and his eyes were very bright with fever. Ryu took his hand, and it was burning hot. "You must go home right now." But Grand wrenched himself free and started running. After a few steps, he stopped and stretched out his arms, swaying to and fro. Then he spun around and fell flat on the pavement, his face stained with tears that kept flowing. Some people who had been approaching stopped abruptly and watched the scene from a distance, not daring to come close. And Ryu had to carry the old man to his car. Grand lay in bed, gasping for breath. His lungs were congested. Ryu pondered. The old fellow hadn't any family. What would be the point? He and Teru could look after him better. Grand's head was buried in a pillow, his cheeks a greenish gray, and his eyes had gone dull. He was gazing fixedly at the fire Teru was kindling. "I'm in a bad way," he muttered. A crackling sound came from his lungs whenever he tried to speak. Dr. Ryu told him not to talk and promised to come back. The sick man's lips parted in a curious smile, and complicity flickered across his face. "If I pull through this, doctor, hats off." A moment later, he sank into extreme prostration. Visiting him again in a few hours, they found him half sitting up in bed, and Dr. Ryu was horrified by the rapid change that had come over him, ravaged by the fires of the disease. He seemed more lucid, and asked them to get his manuscript from the drawer where he kept it.
Maybe you guys should take her.
While Teru handed him the sheets, he pressed them to his chest without looking at them, then handed them to the doctor, indicating with a gesture that he should read them. There were 50 pages of manuscript. Glancing through them, Dr. Ryu saw that the writing consisted almost all of the same sentence written again and again with variants, simplifications or elaborations.
We're both very happy to see you.
The month of May, the lady on horseback, the avenue of the Bois. These recurred and regrouped in different patterns. There were explanatory notes, some very long, and lists of alternatives, and at the foot of the last page was written in a very clear hand, "My dearest Jean, today is Christmas Day and..." 8 words only. Above it, in copperplate script, was the latest version of the famous phrase. "Read it," he said, and Dr. Ryu did. One fine morning in May, a slim young horsewoman might have been seen riding a glossy sorrel mare along the avenue of the Bois, among the flowers. "Is that it?" There was a quaver in the old voice. He began to toss about in bed. I know what you're thinking. Fine isn't the word.
I read, and then I had
Ryu
to
clasped his
record the
hand.
reading because...
"No, doctor," he said. "It's too late and there's no time." And he suddenly said in a loud, shrill voice, "Burn it." The doctor hesitated, but Grand repeated it again, in so violent a tone and with such agony that Ryu walked across to the fireplace and dropped the sheets on the dying fire, which blazed up. And there was a sudden flood of light in the room. When the doctor came back, Grand had his back turned, his face almost touching the wall. After his serum injection, Ryu whispered to his friend that Grand might not last the night, and Teru volunteered to stay with him. All night, Dr. Ryu was haunted by the idea of Grand dying. But the next morning, he found the patient sitting up in bed, talking to Teru. His temperature was down, and there were no symptoms other than a generalized exhaustion. "Yes, doctor," Grand said. "I was over hasty, but I'll start the book over. You'll see. I remember every word." Ryu looked at Teru dubiously. "We must wait," he said. At noon, the only change was for the better, and by nightfall, Grand could be considered out of danger. Ryu was completely baffled by this resurrection. Other surprises were in store for him. At the same time, there was brought to the hospital a girl whose case Ryu diagnosed as hopeless, and he had sent her immediately to the isolation ward. She was delirious and had every symptom of pneumonic plague. The next morning, however, her temperature had fallen. As in Grand's case, the doctor assumed this was the ordinary morning fall that his experience had taught him to regard as a bad sign. But at noon, her temperature showed no rise, and at night it went up only 1 degree. And the next morning it was down to normal. Although completely exhausted, the girl was breathing. Ryu remarked to Teru that her recovery was against every rule, favorably. And in the course of the next week, he noticed 4 more patients, similar cases that came to his notice. The old asthma patient was bubbling over with excitement when Ryu and Teru visited him at the end of the week. "Would you ever have believed it?" he said. "The little bastards are coming out again." "Who?" "The rats." Not one living or dead rat had been seen in the town since April. "Does that mean it's starting all over again?" Teru asked. The old man was rubbing his hands. "You should see him running, doctor." He himself had seen 2 rats slipping into the house by the street door, And some neighbors, too, had told him they had rats in their basements. In some houses, people had heard those familiar scratchings and rustlings behind the woodwork. Dr. Ryu awaited with much interest the mortality figures that were announced every Monday. For the first time since the beginning, this week they showed a decrease. 5 less deaths this week. The scale within all of our own minds of